Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station. My name's Andy and I will be on your radio for the next hour. I'm coming to you once again from Whadjuk Noongar country on the west coast, but I have been keeping an eye on what's happening in Brisbane, and in the last week, part of the news has been the Greens takeover of Queensland, with the federal seats of Griffith and Ryan both won by the Greens, and Brisbane possibly still in the balance, but the Greens very much in the hunt. It has been dubbed by some of the media around the country the Greensland election, and those of us who have been around political organising in Brisbane know that it's been a long time coming. There's been a lot of work put in by Greens people, and so on the show today I'm going to speak to a couple of them. Liam Flenady, who was the campaign manager for Max Chandler Mather's successful run in Griffith, and Esther Vale, who was also a successful Greens campaign manager just across the river in Ryan, where Elizabeth Watson-Brown has won the seat. I have a wide-ranging conversation with them both over the length of the show around how they think these campaigns have successfully grown, about what their hopes are for having parliamentarians in, and about what we can learn from this, both for what it says about our society and how we can build social movements to make it better. So stick around, that's what we'll be listening to. Certainly I don't intend to align this show with a political party, but if you've been listening to Paradigm Shift for a long time, you'd know that we are about environmental sustainability and about social equality, and I think the Greens have shown that they are committed to these principles as well, and it certainly felt good on election night to see these candidates being successful on that kind of platform, and also to see the back of Scott Morrison after 4 years of ScoMo and 8 years of Liberals in power. It's been a horrendous time of climate denialism, of corruption and mistreatment of women, and very happy to see the end of it. But as promised, we are going to speak with a couple of Greens campaigners about their success in the recent election. Let's have a listen.
I am Liam Flenady, and look, I was the campaign manager for the seat of Griffith at this recent federal election for the Greens.
Hi, I'm Esther Vale. I was a campaign manager for Libby Watson-Brown in Ryan.
Well, congratulations to you both on being successful campaign managers. It was certainly a pretty remarkable event for the Greens. I guess, how is the party and the two campaign teams feeling after it all?
Feeling really good, feeling a bit tired. I think it's starting to hit me now, because these were long campaigns, Andy. I think Ryan was 12 months, Griffith was 14, something like that.
Yeah, 12 full months for us over here. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've been slogging our guts out for a while now, so a bit exhausted, but it's an exciting. I don't think anyone. I think Esther, you were probably a little bit more uh, optimistic about your chances in Ryan. By the end of the Griffith campaign, I was convinced we were going to lose. I mean, part of me thought that we were going to get this enormous swing, but I wouldn't allow myself to believe it. And so we've woken up in this weird world where we've won at least two, if not three, lower house seats for the Greens in Queensland when no one thought that was possible, particularly winning off incumbents, which is something that the Greens haven't achieved before. Adam Bant won his seat in 2010 when the incumbent stood down. And so these things are pretty unprecedented, and we're feeling pretty excited about what it means in terms of our ability to build more capacity um, for sort of progressive or radical politics, or whatever the hell you want to call it, and sort of disseminate, I suppose, to some extent, the approach that we've taken here, which I think is bearing fruit. And I think people want to see how they can replicate that to some extent in their areas. So we're excited about that as well.
Yeah, 100%. On that comment about being optimistic, on my most optimistic, I thought we might come right down to the wire, and I was absolutely as shell shocked as anyone else that it actually got called on the night along with Griffith. That was my one hope, was that Griffith would get called on the night, so you lot could all party. But I thought we'd be in for 2 weeks of scrutineering. But that's where Brisbane is at the moment, with
Yes.
just watching those additional counts coming in and waiting to see who comes on top in the 3CP to then see who wins. But my understanding is that it's looking really good for Brisbane at the moment, and getting that sort of trifecta of the three seats in Brisbane.
Mm. Um, well, I guess we're in a position the Greens haven't been in before federally, where with a few lower house representatives, and including in Queensland, where there's never been any before.
Mm.
What are the hopes for what this will mean over the next 3 years?
Do you want to have a crack at that, Esther? I've got lots of thoughts, but they're swirling.
Yeah, I think we're definitely building a lot of capacity to keep campaigning, and if you've paid any attention to the Queensland Greens over the last few years, we are paying attention to all levels of government. So we're going to put a lot of effort into winning council seats, winning state seats, and then protecting, if not expanding, come next federal election.
Yeah, I think it is. I think our immediate thoughts, I'm the same as Esther. My immediate thoughts are towards how to consolidate these wins in council and state elections, and also then on a more community organizing level, like how do we deepen that aspect of our party over the next few years.
100%.
Yeah, and so a lot of my mind is on that, and I suppose that's partly because, and maybe same with Esther, because we're campaign managers, not necessarily like policy wonks. We're not thinking as much about the interventions in Parliament, but thinking more in terms of the on the ground organising that we can now really massively scale up. And so that's our immediate sort of thoughts. And I think, but I also do think the wins themselves, and then having people as talented as Max and Libby and hopefully Stephen as well in there, to push for I guess, it's like a mixed, it's a coalition in the Greens here between, I think, democratic socialists and like left liberals, but like it is a particularly, I think, increasingly clear politics of universality. Like everyone should have access to the things they need to be able to live a decent life. Tax, and then the class politics is becoming increasingly part of the overall politics, that we can broadcast that to the nation even more. And so I think, so there's the on the ground organizing and consolidation of the wins. And then there's that question of how do we capitalize on this to, you know, um, drive a politics that is, broadly class based and is broadly, I think, sort of, I guess you'd say it's socialist in its orientation, or like democratic socialist in its orientation, even if not everyone would describe themselves as that. So yeah, that's I suppose that's where we're at.
Well, it might come back to socialism, but it is a bit of a surprise there that you haven't just talked about what it might mean to hold the balance of power and
Mm,
negotiations with Labor and things like that. Already, Labor's sort of being a bit frosty. Is that not what the Greens are seeing as a win out of here? Some kind of idea of a balance of power?
well,
Well, we certainly
yeah.
have a good balance of power in the Senate in our own
Mm,
right, in the Greens, with getting three new senators across Australia. So there's a lot of power for the Greens in the Senate. In the lower house, it seems like Labor are basically claiming majority already, although it
mm,
seems like a few hundred votes in Macnamara would have been the difference between five Greens lower house MPs and Labor not having majority
yeah.
in their own right. But I think Labor think they've got a lot of crossbench to work with, and they might try and be a bit frosty with the Greens. But
Mm,
our politics this election has always been looking forward to work with Labor and with the crossbench however we can, and not necessarily um, relying on a strict balance of power agreement to work for the community and get wins for our politics.
And I think the other thing, yeah, I think that's all correct, Esther. And I think Labor, if they fall one seat short, are probably going to find the like most compliant of the independents to sort of work with rather than us.
Yeah,
But I think one thing that my partner Nicole, who's Amy's chief of staff, has been saying a lot over the last few days is that we going into council and state, and then also on a more federal level, um, the fear now of the Greens surely means we can extract some concessions out of the powers that be. I think there'll be an attempt from Labor and the Liberal City Council to do more green stuff to try to hold us off. Um, so that's the other way we can exert some influence over, on a sort of more like legislative level. Um, my feeling is that we're still shut out. Like, yeah, I think the Senate we're going to actually get some good outcomes, and that's really exciting. But I think in terms of the kind of more governmental like decisions, the best we can really do then is a real like um, put the fear of God in the government and in the state government and in the Brisbane City Council and force them to do some stuff that's you know speeds up, for instance, renewables and whatever else. But yeah, I'm pessimistic to the extent that they're going to sort of go against the corporate overlords too much and back in sort of more Greens policies just out of fear of us. But now they're wedged pretty significantly. So you never know what they're going to do to try to sort of mitigate against this green surge. I look forward to seeing them squirm, to be perfectly frank.
yeah, I'd agree with all of that.
Well, let's talk about local Queensland Greens, and it sort of surprised the nation. And it's interesting, a lot of the national coverage, they're like, oh, it must be because of the floods. Queenslanders
Yeah.
believe in climate change because of the floods. And it's just, I mean, the national media just doesn't pay attention to things outside of Sydney and Melbourne. But those of us in
Mm,
Brisbane have seen the way that inner Brisbane has grown over a number of elections,
yeah.
with Queensland starting with local government with John S3 and moving out to two separate state elections, winning seats and growing in this. And so we have a different kind of analysis. And it seems to me that that's a very interesting depiction, the fact that it did start at local government and then it's kind of expanded outwards.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think the Jono breakthrough in 2016 cannot be overstated. um, because it provided for the initial model for how we campaign. Max Chandler Mather ran Jono's campaign, and the two of them came up like just decided they were going to door knock the crap out of the Gab Award. I mean, having said that, Drew Hutton did that back in 2006 and got a remarkable result. So it's not like it's a new idea, but I think just the kind of fresh energy of Jono and Max and a crew that coalesced around that. Also around a more radical politics that was much more antagonistic to the sort of political class and a bit more, lefty, I guess, like in a mixed sense, shades of anarchism, but also, and then obviously socialists and whatever else in that mix, kind of gave the Queen's sort of, and when Jono won, it sort of very quickly disseminated across the Queensland Greens, that approach, and it became known as the Queensland strategy, which is, talking about more material like issues that affect people's lives, not just talking about climate and the reef all the time. Obviously, not dropping that, but trying to focus in on the stuff that's really like hitting people in their daily lives. Running large scale field campaigns where you door knock as many people as possible, but a specific approach to door knocking as well, one that's not just policy focused, but one that's very much about having deep, rich, meaningful conversations, all those sorts of things. Sort of I feel really kicked off after that 2016 win, and then obviously getting Michael Berkman up in 2017 and a gigantic swing to Amy and a bunch of other seats in 2017, and then wins and huge swings at every election since. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, Andy, that like the media class were like, oh wow, this is so out of the blue. How did this happen? But it's been at least 6 years, maybe 7 years in the making, and it's all just rolling out and refining a particular sort of strategic approach and politics that I think now I'm really excited to be able to, because people, weren't paying attention and now they are, and so the chance to be able to talk to the wider left and Greens around the country and whatever, and say, hey, like, obviously we don't have all the answers, but we're clearly doing something right, and it'd be worth seeing how some of this stuff could be applied elsewhere.
Yeah, in terms of talking about a sense of politics that's so much broader than the single issue sort of thing that the other parties, especially as well as the media, love to paint us as, and you've seen in the media since the election is people saying it's a luxury to be able to vote Greens, when our politics is really, when you actually pay attention to it, so universal. And I think we have people who would support the Greens policies because they personally would benefit from it. So because
Mm.
they, you know, can relate to the struggle of not being able to go to the dentist because of the cost. But so many people as well who will come over to our side because they may not have those struggles, but they can identify with them in their community, and they can relate to other people and have an empathetic politics and say, well, look, I might not be struggling, but my neighbours have been as well. So this is the best policy platform to put my vote behind.
It is interesting, and Liam, you used the word socialist to describe it earlier, and certainly there's more um, state intervention or something like that in Greens
Mm.
policies than in many other parties, and so in that way it is. But it's sort of funny compared to traditional ideas of how to grow socialism in that, I guess, one, it's at the electoral ballot box that it's sort of being done, but also that it is, I mean, fairly well off inner city areas where
Mm.
this is happening rather than, going to the working class.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think all those ironies aren't lost on us, Andy. Like, and I say socialism, but it is definitely a spectrum here, depending on who you're talking to within the Queensland Greens, as to whether you're kind of like, yeah, I would say left liberal, or social democratic, or socialist, or even anarchist. But and so it's not like, yeah, we have a particular like ideology that's at the root of it all. But um, I think on the electoral stuff, I think I do think that an electoral like part of like, or an electoral strategy is pretty central to at least how I conceive of socialism. It's certainly not the be all and end all. Like, you will need a heck of a lot of other parts of the strategy. Obviously, workers organizing, community organizing, various other things. But I'm of a tradition of socialism, I suppose, that sees winning electoral gains as very critical. So I don't think that necessarily contradicts it. But I think the that question about the working class is a really interesting one. Like, what is the class dimension of all of this? And I feel like in the seat of Griffith, at least, we certainly won a cross-class coalition. And I think Esther was sort of hinting at that just now with, that we've got more well-off people voting for us because they think that, our policy platform is sort of like the right thing to do, even if it doesn't necessarily I think everyone would benefit from our platform. Everyone would benefit if dental was brought into Medicare. Everyone would benefit if uni and TAFE were made free again, everyone would benefit from tackling climate change. But in terms of, they're not struggling. Some people who vote for us, but they think it's the right thing to do. But then there is a large layer of people who are voting for us because I think they're like part of a new emerging renter class that's not necessarily defined by its occupation, but defined by how precarious it is. And that's 50% as the seat of Griffith is renters. And something that Max talks about a lot is just how this trend towards this slight, I suppose you would say, dispossessed renter class um, is fueling the capacity to, or it's like opening up space for radical politics. Because if you're a renter, you don't really, and you don't really have a lot of stake in the status quo. Home ownership in particular is such a great way for people to feel like they've got, something to lose. And I suppose if we're talking about socialism, that it really is one of the defining features of, Marx's definition of the proletariat, right? That it's kind of got nothing to lose, but it's chains. If you're a renter, you don't really have a lot to lose. And so you're willing to take gambles on stuff that might disrupt the status quo. And so I think there's a lot of, I would say, and I've written in little reflections that this wasn't necessarily a youth surge, but our experience, at least in a number of booths across the electorate on election day, was renters in their 20s and 30s and maybe even 40s coming to the ballot box and clutching their Greens how to vote and telling everybody else to piss off. And I think that's not necessarily the working class as it's been defined in that old sort of socialist tradition, but it has a similar quality to it. More broadly, I think eventually we will have to expand out to the sort of less well-off areas. But I still think even in the inner city, there's a class of people or classes of people that are relatively dispossessed and are relatively precarious that we want to relate to and help organize to fight for their interests.
It's interesting, like, the Greens politically are quite different from the Teal independents, like, policy wise, but in a way it does seem to be sort of the same thing, especially in Ryan and Brisbane, if it happens, where you've won these seats off the Liberal Party rather than Labor, and it's inner city, well-off electorates that are, I guess, getting disillusioned with Liberals, being held captive by mining companies or whatever. Do you see it as part of the same broad thing, or do you think that the differences in politics makes this a very different thing?
I think, to take a gamble on a third party or a minor party is a pretty big thing, and you have to reach a lot of people. What we've definitely seen through our campaign was taking votes off Liberal and Labor as well, especially in those areas with high proportions of renters. I think if people would have preferred to vote for a Teal candidate, um, where the Greens were presenting a policy platform that was much more economically left, talking about taxing the billionaires to pay for all of the things we have to offer, I I don't really think it would have been enough to make people shift their votes so much towards us if they weren't, agreeing with it. And
Mm.
really, I think the major limiting factor for us is our ability to reach people. And when we reach people, we are essentially, I think, taking their votes at a pretty equal rate, no matter kind of where their background is.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. I think our campaign didn't have a teal quality to it at all. We didn't talk about integrity or an ICAC at all. We did obviously talk about climate change, but it was in a very class oriented way, like we're going to take on the big mining corporations and billionaires, and we're going to fund a rapid transition. It wasn't this kind of technocratic approach to climate politics. And I think from what I've gathered, Esther, like while sort of some of Libby's communications had a little bit more of that stuff, it was still pretty forthright in how antagonistic to the sort of ruling class, if not using that term, the politics was. And so it's really great to reflect on how in a seat like Ryan, you can go out and have what is it, almost 16,000 conversations and put out all these materials into the electorate that do very, very seriously go after big big mining corporations and say we're going to redistribute wealth and we're going to do all this very economically left-wing stuff and just win a butt ton of votes. So I don't know. I mean, obviously some of the things that were driving the teal wave also drove people to us in Brisbane. But I think the quality that what's different is that we had this infrastructure and this politics that was able to reorient that disaffection towards something else. And it's amazing to think that all of these people were very, very, very happy to vote for something as economically left wing as well, while they were also worried about those other issues.
On a similar note to that, in I guess talking about the geography of votes, Queensland's electoral map, which already in the state government is quite clearly delineated between bigger cities and regional centres and rural. At federal now, it's an extreme delineation between all rural or everything out of Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast is Liberal, and then Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast is now increasingly green as well as Labor. I mean, is that something that you think about these divides and in the way our society is going? I guess that we're quite a fractured society in a lot of ways, and this could be seen as kind of a growing divide separate from kind of older ideas of politics. Is that something that the Greens, especially now that you're looking like quite an inner city party, is that something you've thought about?
That's a tricky one, Andy. Yeah. Um, my yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's it's a concern, right? That we can be painted as an inner city elite party and then not find a way to reach out beyond that. My Firstly, it's really great that we've been able to get Penny Allman-Payne elected in the Senate. She's a teacher and a staunch unionist up in Gladstone. I don't know if I think she intends to have her office there or somewhere that's not Brisbane centric. And so having that ability for her, who can speak with great authority to regional Queenslanders, I think is a real boost for us, so that we're not just tied to the inner city of Brisbane. So that's the first thing that excites me. But I think we've got to be a little bit strategic. The Greens aren't going to win, a vote in the state electorates, at least in places like like Rocky and whatever, sitting at 3 or 4% of the vote. And so you can't just go there and expect to be able to build big support and capacity and win people over. But places like Cairns and sort of outer suburban areas of Brisbane, I suppose, as well, where it's quite working class and whatever, we are sitting at a good starting point of our support and vote, and it's not unrealistic to think in 10 years we could be winning council and state seats at the very least in places like Cairns, in places like Ipswich and Logan. And so, like that doesn't fix it, but I think making inroads there is probably an important part of our ongoing strategy, rather than just locking down Brisbane and then being surrounded by and basically we don't want to further that divide and make it feel like, oh, if you're a regional Queenslander, you got to hate the Greens, and if you're an inner city person, you've got to be a smug greenie. Like, that's the last thing we want. but you've got to be strategic about where you put your resources and find where there's already an organic starting point for your sort of support. And I think that's places like Cairns, and that's places like Ipswich and Logan.
Yeah, and that's definitely how, the Greens go about preparing their campaigns is, to back in where we already have the capacity to, run a massive campaign. And we had thousands of volunteers across the city, and, they're people who are wanting to campaign in their local area, and it's not something we can just ship off and, um, create a massive campaign out of nowhere. And
Parachute in an
it's
inner city Brisbane person into like regional Australia, like Christina Keneally, and see how they get
absolutely.
wrecked.
Yeah, so I think the Greens really do see, the need to build local capacity across the entire state, and I think if we can do that, definitely a lot easier to knock on every door or half the doors in somewhere like Griffith or Ryan than it is to reach that many voters in, say, Maranoa. But I think if we were to eventually build the campaigning capacity and the local on the ground presence to speak to that many people, we would see massive gains in all those areas outside the city as well.
Yeah, I'd also say that like a lot of the policies that we've got in our platform, we probably don't have a we probably don't have a robust enough messaging and policy platform and stuff to go to speak to like real rural and regional Queensland. Like we probably do need to think more about that. But in terms of like regional centres, there's our like in terms of fully funding health and education, expanding in like local public infrastructure, in terms of dental and mental health into Medicare, in terms of building public homes and rent caps and all that sort of stuff. That stuff should theoretically resonate even better there than it does in the inner city Brisbane. Like they're universal things, and the regions and sort of outer burbs of Queensland suffer more. So like there's theoretically, once we start building that local capacity, like Esther says, and we are starting to do that, like there's really good people working in these areas that just don't have the critical mass yet. Theoretically, these messages should resonate even better. It just requires a bit of a way to reframe the Greens as a populist working class organization rather than a elitist technocratic organization. And that's what the Queensland Greens have been trying to do for some time now. And I think we're starting to see the results of that.
Yeah, I think in terms of, as you say, getting the messaging that really speaks to the people out there, what needs to happen to refine that isn't sort of people in Brisbane or Melbourne sitting around thinking about what would work, but the capacity increasing on the ground to actually test those messages and say, hey, this is how our policies are resonating with people. This is how we can talk to people about it.
Okay, well, finally, one of the things that I've long stressed on the paradigm shift is that democracy doesn't begin and end at the ballot box, that people power works in
Mm.
all kinds of different ways. So I guess finally, do you think that this campaign and the success of it electorally, I mean, you're not suddenly going to legislate in all the things that the Greens have worked for. You assume there has to be some other movements to kind of build that power. But do you think there are lessons learned from this that can go to other kind of social movements and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited about how this some of this stuff might be able to be translated or sort of yeah, like filter into what people are doing in other areas, and trade unions in particular. People, where there's people who feel they've got the space in trade unions to, a lot of this stuff that we've been doing is inspired by people like Jane McAlevey over in the US, who's doing all this work in the union movement. And it's come to electoral politics here, but then there's no reason why it can't go back into sort of workplace organizing and community organizing, particularly around just the scale, the mass approach to it, the political education that we put into our the trainings that we run, the community organizing that we've done. I don't think anybody, at least in my circle in the Greens up here, feels like we'll just have an electoral path to power anyway. And so I think we've always wanted to just get a few big runs on the board first in electoral politics before we start fleshing out the overall approach. Um, to community organising, to workplace organising, and so on and so forth. And that'll come from outside the Greens as well. I hope that the wins here just inspire more people to get active in whatever it is that they're doing, whether that's inside or outside the Greens. So yeah, I mean that's a vague answer, Andy, but yeah, I think there's a fair bit of stuff that we can translate. I think people understanding what it takes as well to win big is what we've learned. I imagine you've learned that as well, Esther. Right? Like
Yeah.
to win big, you need to really like the organizational capacity that you need is quite large, and I think a lot of people don't realize it. Often when you run an election campaign, I suppose this is the first one I've been on where I felt like, oh yeah, we really did it. We really, really talked to enough people. We really reached enough people. We really did everything we needed to do. Most times when you run an election campaign, and I think it's probably the same with like organizing a protest or whatever, it feels like you're bigger than you are. It's very easy to be sort of have a bit of a confirmation bias or whatever and feel like, oh yeah, look at all of us in King George Square, or look at all of us on this campaign in an electorate. We've spoken to so many people, we're getting all this positive feedback, but you forget that there's just these millions of people out there who don't know the fuck you are and have never even heard about what you're doing. And so realizing just how big you need to get, and then saying, okay, well, I just need to adjust my parameters of what needs to be done and what's possible, I think is big learning for me here. And I'll definitely be ranting to everyone who's willing to listen about that. We just need to adjust our sense of scale if we're going to get the wins that we want, whether that's a community win, a workplace win, or an electoral win.
Yeah, definitely on this side of the river, we don't think that electoral politics is the be all end all, and have really been looking to the sort of social organising that Griffith campaign did as the sort of way of the future, the next sort of step, where I think Griffith was sort of one election down the track from where we were. We just happened to catch up in terms of getting the vote this time around. So I definitely think that is where we really need to focus our attention, because it is, it's not just about winning votes, but building the base of people with the kind of values that we share of, most of what we talked about this campaign, which was a real sense of universalism in our politics. And, building that up takes a lot more than just a campaign and just putting one person's face in front of people. So that's definitely the next step for us over here as well.
On the paradigm shift, that was Liam Flenady there and Esther Vale, a couple of people who have been quite successful in the recent election in their job as campaign managers for the Green seats of Ryan and Griffith. And it sure is glad to be in the post-ScoMo era of Australian politics. The last 4 years has been characterised by a leader with just extremely shallow responses to issues that people were concerned about, refused to bring in a federal ICAC and in fact referred to the anti-corruption body as a kangaroo court, refused to take real action on climate change, but instead would continually lie about Australia doing lots on climate change or having a plan, refused to do anything for women, even women abused within his own party, but continually talked about himself as a family man, caring about his own wife and daughters, and so many other things. Failed on COVID, saying it wasn't a race, our race against to vaccinate against an epidemic, and of course the bushfires, his woeful response of dodging responsibility there. So anyway, we have played a few anti-ScoMo songs, but of course because one Prime Minister's gone doesn't automatically mean that Australia is a million times better. It is the work of people trying to organise together to improve our lives and improve our society that will make it better. And so that's why it's been good to be talking to Liam Flenady and Esther Vale about the work that they've done to get Greens campaigners elected this election, but also about what it means for where our society's at, how we can work together to make a change, what they think some of the reasons for success were, and they do put it down to a lot of hard work and a lot of going to meet people and talk to people, build those connections, and over the next 3 years, we are sure to be disappointed at times by our new government and even by all the independent and minor parties that have been elected. And so the road to a better society is a long one and full of a lot of hard work, and we will have to keep going along the way. But for now, we can slightly celebrate the election results and start planning together for what's next. The 4ZZZ, of course, will be with you all the way, bringing you all your local music, current affairs, community news, and voices from the margins. And Paradigm Shift will keep going each week as well. See you then.